Hi, my name is Gerhard Schwantner and welcome to Selling Power's Daily Report. Today we continue our conversation with Brian Dietmeier, the founder and CEO of Think Inc. Welcome, Brian.
It's good to be back.
Let's talk about the consequences when there's no agreement. Is there a strategy for that?
There is, and as I've mentioned before, it's the most important part of any negotiation. It is ultimately the thing that's being negotiated, and the way that manifests itself in a deal is a customer saying, I can get the same thing cheaper elsewhere, your stuff is too expensive compared to the market, that kind of thing. So what happens is buyers most often oversimplify this consequence of no agreement notion. They say, well, it's the same thing. You and your competitors all have the same thing. And we need to start with the fact that just, unless you're selling a pure commodity, that's just not the case. With most business-to-business deals where you have a professional buyer on one side and a professional seller on the other side, it's a very complex deal, or you wouldn't need that level of professionalism there. So let me give you an example. One of our customers is a sales technology company, and after we had done some work with them, one of the regions called in and said, you know, we need more help. One of our competitors has almost exactly the same stuff as us, and our customers are just constantly pitting us against price because it is pretty much the same. And here's the trick. They believed their stuff was the same, and we find this a lot. So we got together with a group of their Midwest region salespeople, and we spent a few hours comparing. We said, you know, if you were a world-class buyer and you were comparing your total value proposition to your best competitor's total value proposition, what were the elements that you would need to compare those two on? And they came up with about 6 headings under technology, global breadth, you know, all sorts, language capabilities, integration issues. They came up with 43 data points that if you were going to compare them to their competitor, there's 43 different hard measurable data points that needed to be compared. By the time we got done with this session, it brings alive this notion of someone saying, I can get the same thing cheaper. It just, again, in most business-to-business deals, you can't. They're way too complex for that, to simplify it by saying it's the same thing. We find that, with the exception of pharmaceutical sales forces, because you're talking about efficacy of drugs and life and death situations, they're prepared to compare one drug or one treatment or one medical device versus another. Most of us selling B2B products or consumer products don't have that same level of data, so we get pulled into this this verbal tactic of it's the same thing everywhere, you need to lower your price. And in fact, it isn't. And if it is, then you just reverse auction the thing on the web.
So I like the way to make the distinction between what we pay for it versus what we're negotiating. And what I'd like for you to help me understand is, how do you get the customer to focus on what it is?
Right. Early on in your sales process, you're asking your customer about those data points. And even if your customers aren't responding, or not responding honestly, you're at least educating them on the multiple variables that should be considered when you're comparing two suppliers side by side. And so the key, again, is to get to this early on. In order to get to it early on, you have to have thought through it a little bit.
So you invite them to engage their intelligence and put their instincts aside.
Right. So as you're collecting sales data, you ask them questions about these items, and it begins to broaden the negotiation, which is really the goal.
Can you simply ask, what are we negotiating here? Would that be too simple?
Well, I think so. What we find is the more kind of open-ended, needs analytical questions, the better data we get. The more drilled down to say, okay, so what is it that you think you're buying from me? I think that would help. But the problem is, you're probably sitting across the desk from someone who hasn't clearly thought through that. You need to know. One of our consultants calls it real-time marketing. We hear a lot about value propositions and that sort of thing. Well, the value prop changes on every deal based on who your competitor is and what your customer's needs are. So when you're doing this work with the customer and you're talking about the multiple aspects of your value proposition, you're doing that real-time marketing. You're getting them to broaden their view of the it that they're buying, which is really the goal. The goal of all this is to broaden the view of what it is that's being purchased.
Thank you, Brian. I got it. And tomorrow we're going to continue our conversation with Brian Dietmeier, and we'll talk about how much are we going to pay for it. We'll talk about price, so tune in tomorrow.